The 60s and 70s gave us legends. The Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. But for every household name, there were just as many bands pushing boundaries, creating masterpieces, and influencing generations, only to fade into obscurity. Some were too ahead of their time, some imploded before they had a chance to break through, and some were just criminally underrated. Join us in this video as we take a look at 15 criminally underrated 60s and 70s bands you won't believe you missed. Number 1. The Outsiders, Netherlands. The garage rock explosion of the 60s was largely an American affair. Bands like the Sonics and the Electric Prunes were shredding through distorted chords and snarling vocals, defining what would eventually become punk. But across the Atlantic in the Netherlands, something equally wild was happening. Unlike most bands of the era, the Outsiders weren't just copying the British invasion. They were building something new. Led by the unpredictable Wally Tax, their sound was darker, more intense, and far moodier than their contemporaries. Their 1968 album CQ is the hidden treasure of 60s garage rock, where American bands stuck to 3-chord bangers. The Outsiders embraced long-winded compositions, eerie atmospheres, and a sense of existential dread that felt years ahead of its time. Songs like Misfit and Daddy Died on Saturday weren't just raw, they were emotional. It was garage rock with depth, a blueprint for the brooding post-punk that would emerge a decade later. But as with so many great bands, success proved elusive. The Outsiders never made it beyond the Netherlands, and by the early 70s they were done. Still, their influence lingers. Punk and post-punk owe them more than they know. Number 2. The 13th Floor Elevators. By the mid-60s, psychedelic rock was beginning to take shape. Bands like the Beatles and the Byrds were dabbling in mind-blowing sounds. But in Texas, far from the San Francisco scene, a band was taking things further than anyone else. The 13th Floor Elevators weren't just experimenting with psychedelia, they were living it. Fronted by the hypnotic, otherworldly Rocky Erickson, the 13th Floor Elevators created a sound that felt like stepping through a portal. Their 1966 debut, the psychedelic sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators, wasn't just an album, it was a manifesto. The cover itself proclaimed, "This is the psychedelic sound in its purest form." And they weren't lying. Songs like You're Gonna Miss Me had the raw energy of garage rock, but were drenched in eerie, reverb-soaked wails. Tommy Hall, the band's resident acid guru, played an electric jug. Yeah, a jug, creating a bubbling alien backdrop that made every song feel like a hallucination. But as visionary as they were, the 13th Floor Elevators were doomed from the start. Texas wasn't exactly the ideal place for an openly psychedelic band in the 60s. Drug busts, paranoia, and mental health struggles tore them apart. By the time they released Easter Everywhere, 1967, a haunting transcendental masterpiece, Rocky Erickson was already unraveling. By the early 70s, the band was done. Erickson spent years in and out of mental institutions, while the rest of the group faded into obscurity. But their influence didn't. You can hear echoes of the 13th Floor Elevators in everyone, from the Flaming Lips to Primal Scream. Psychedelic rock as we know it wouldn't exist without them. Number 3. The Pretty Things. Rock history loves its rebels. Keith Richards, Iggy Pop, Sid Vicious, but before them, there were the Pretty Things. In the early 60s, they were London's dirtiest, wildest, most chaotic band. While the Rolling Stones were cutting their teeth on blues covers, the Pretty Things were taking things further, louder, nastier, and more unhinged. Their early singles like Rosalind and Don't Bring Me Down were raw, sneering, and bursting with energy. They were proto-punks before punk even had a name. But then, something incredible happened. Instead of staying in the garage rock lane, the Pretty Things evolved. By 1968, they had created SF Sorrow, a sprawling, ambitious concept album that predated The Who's Tommy and the Kinks' Arthur. SF Sorrow wasn't just an album. It was a story, unfolding song by song, drenched in psychedelia and existential dread. It was revolutionary. But here's the thing. Nobody heard it. Released with almost no promotion, it was buried before it even had a chance to make an impact. They kept going, dabbling in everything from hard rock to proto-glam. But the mainstream never caught on. Despite influencing everyone from David Bowie to The Clash, they remained known only to those who dug deep enough. But for those who do discover them, they're not just another forgotten band. They're a magnificent revelation. Number 4. Budgie. Hailing from Wales, Budgie was heavier than almost anything else in the early 70s. Their riffs were massive, their rhythms were crushing, and their energy was pure adrenaline. If you close your eyes and listen to them, you'd swear you were hearing some lost NWO BHM band from the 80s. Except Budgie was doing it a decade earlier. Their 1973 album, Never Turn Your Back on a Friend, was an absolute monster. Breadfan was so phenomenal that Metallica covered it years later, introducing Budgie's legacy to a new generation. And then there's Parents, an epic, almost Zeppelin-esque journey through acoustic passages and explosive crescendos. Burke Shelley's high-pitched vocals gave Budgie a unique identity, while Tony Borge's guitar work was simply devastating. Listen to Guts from their 1971 debut. It's essentially doom metal before doom metal even existed. But despite their raw power, Budgie remained criminally overlooked. They never had a massive hit. They never reached Zeppelin or Sabbath levels of fame. But what they did do was pave the way for heavy metal's evolution. Without Budgie, bands like Iron Maiden, Metallica, and Megadeth wouldn't sound the way they do. They were that influential. Number 5. Love. Los Angeles in the mid-60s was a swirling mix of sunshine and chaos. The Sunset Strip was alive with guitars and flower power idealism. But no band captured both the beauty and the darkness of the era quite like Love. At the helm was Arthur Lee, a frontman as enigmatic as he was unpredictable. He wasn't just a musician, he was a visionary. While other bands played with psychedelic aesthetics, Love embodied them. Their 1960 album Forever Changes was a combination of rich orchestration, cryptic lyrics, and an underlying sense of doom. Tracks like Alone Again or shimmered with delicate, Spanish-influenced guitar work, while A House Is Not a Motel erupted into a frenzy of electric solos, like a beautiful dream turning into a nightmare. But Love was more than just one album. Before Forever Changes, they were garage rockers, churning out raw electric tracks on Love, 1966, and Da Capo, 1966. Afterward, they leaned into bluesy hard rock with For Sale, 1969, and False Start, 1970, the latter featuring Jimi Hendrix on guitar. Yet despite their brilliance, Love never reached the heights they deserved. Maybe it was Arthur Lee's refusal to leave LA, while other bands toured. Maybe it was his unpredictable nature, which led to frequent lineup changes. Or maybe Love was simply too unconventional for mainstream success. Whatever the reason, their influence is undeniable. The Doors, Led Zeppelin, and countless others owe them a debt. And those who stumble upon their music today, they're left wondering how a band this good slipped through the cracks. Number 6. The Move.
My head's attracted to a magnetic wave of sound.
Every once in a while, a band comes along with everything. Charisma, talent, great songwriting, yet somehow they never quite break through. The Move was that band. In late 60s Britain, they were poised to be huge. Led by Roy Wood, they had it all. The melody-driven brilliance of the Beatles, the wild energy of The Who, and a knack for showmanship that made every performance exhilarating. Early on, they were smashing TV sets on stage and blowing up cars before The Who even thought about destroying their first guitar. But what really set The Move apart? Their music. Songs like I Can Hear the Grass Grow and Flowers in the Rain were pure psychedelic perfection. Catchy, colorful, and packed with inventive harmonies. Their 1968 self-titled album proved they could do more than just singles, blending psych, hard rock, and orchestral flourishes with ease. Yet despite charting hit after hit in the UK, the move barely made a dent in America. Bad management, constant lineup changes, and a general reluctance to tour overseas kept them from reaching the superstardom they deserved. And then Roy Wood, always restless, always experimenting, moved on to something bigger: Electric Light Orchestra. The move's final albums leaned into progressive rock, hinting at the symphonic, otherworldly sound ELO would later perfect. But by the time Message from the Country, 1971, came out, the move was already fading. If things had gone just a little differently, the move might be spoken about in the same breath as the Kinks or the Small Faces. Instead, they remain one of rock's greatest what-ifs. Number 7. Hawkwind. Forget Pink Floyd's dreamy cosmic explorations. Hawkwind was space rock in its rawest, most unfiltered form. A relentless, high-energy, mind-expanding assault on the senses. Formed in 1969, Hawkwind wasn't just a band, they were an experience. Their concerts were a swirling maelstrom of pounding rhythms, hypnotic synthesizers, and psychedelic light shows. Their music felt less like a collection of songs and more like a never-ending voyage through the universe. Driven by the relentless pulse of Dave Brock's guitar and the primal energy of Lemmy Kilmister's bass. Their 1973 live album Space Ritual captured them at their most potent, a chaotic, immersive sonic trip that blended pounding rock grooves with electronic textures and spoken word passages about alien landscapes and dystopian futures. Tracks like Brainstorm and Master of the Universe weren't just songs, they were full throttle hyperspace jumps. But it wasn't just about volume and intensity. Albums like Hall of the Mountain Grill, 1974, and Warrior on the Edge of Time, 1975, proved that Hawkwind could craft intricate, atmospheric compositions just as easily as they could melt faces with pure sonic force. Despite their underground status, their impact was massive. They laid the groundwork for everything from punk, Lemmy would later go on to form Motorhead, to heavy metal, to modern stoner rock. Without Hawkwind, there's no Monster Magnet, no Caius, no space rock as we know it. Number 8. Atomic Rooster. Somewhere between the swirling organs of Deep Purple and the doomy heaviness of Black Sabbath, Atomic Rooster carved out a sound that was both sinister and electrifying. Formed in 1969 by Vincent Crane, the former keyboardist of the Crazy World of Arthur Brown, Atomic Rooster was built around the organ. Not as a background texture, not as a supporting instrument, but as a weapon. Crane's playing was wild, theatrical, and ferocious, like a mad scientist commanding a storm. Their early albums Atomic Rooster, 1970, and Death Walks Behind You, 1970, blended progressive rock complexity with an almost proto-metal heaviness. The title track of Death Walks Behind You was pure dread and menace, with pounding piano chords and eerie atmospherics that felt like a horror film come to life. And then there was Tomorrow Night, their biggest hit, groovy, ominous, and driven by Crane's demonic organ licks. But the band was in constant flux. Guitarist John Ducan brought a harder, more rock-oriented sound, while drummer Carl Palmer left to pursue bigger ambitions. Crane, the band's only constant member, kept reinventing their sound, dabbling in funk, jazz, and even soul as the years went on. Atomic Rooster never quite broke through to mainstream success, but their influence is undeniable. They laid the groundwork for everything from progressive metal to gothic rock. Bands like Opeth and Ghost owe a huge debt to Crane's dark, dramatic compositions. Number 9. Van de Graaf Generator. Progressive rock in the 70s was full of grand, ambitious bands, but none of them sounded like Van de Graaf Generator. Where their contemporaries built lush symphonic landscapes, VDGG created nightmares. Their music was aggressive, jagged, and full of tension. Instead of guitar solos, they had screaming saxophones, Instead of soaring anthems, they had apocalyptic epics. And at the center of it all was Peter Hamel. Hamel wasn't just a frontman, he was a force. His vocals veered from delicate whispers to unhinged howls, turning every song into an emotional roller coaster. Albums like Pawn Hearts, 1971, and H to He, Who Am the Only One, 1970, weren't just prog rock. They were full-scale existential crises set to music. Man Erg, with its shifting time signatures and disturbing lyrics, was haunting. A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers was 23 minutes of pure psychological trauma. It was intense, maybe too intense. VDGG never broke into the mainstream. Their music was too dense, too unsettling, too much. But their influence spread far and wide, from punk pioneers like John Lydon to later experimentalists like Radiohead. They weren't just progressive rock, they were something else entirely, something darker, more dangerous, and completely unforgettable. Number 10. Caravan.
Chance upon a golf girl selling cups of tea.
There's something magical about Caravan. While their Canterbury scene peers dove headfirst into complexity and abstraction, Caravan took a different approach, blending progressive rock's ambition with the warm, pastoral beauty of folk and surreal whimsy of psychedelia. Their magnum opus In the Land of Grey and Pink, 1971, is a masterpiece of gentle yet adventurous songwriting. Golf Girl is a perfect example, quirky, melodic, and utterly charming, complete with whimsical lyrics about drinking tea in the rain. But then there's 9 Feet Underground, a 22-minute suite of shifting moods, jazz-inspired solos, and intricate instrumental interplay that solidified Caravan as serious musicians and storytellers. Unlike the bombast of early Genesis of the cerebral intensity of King Crimson, Caravan's music flowed. It wasn't about showing off, it was about creating a vibe, an atmosphere that pulled you into their world. Even in their more extended, complex pieces, there was always a sense of warmth and accessibility. Despite their undeniable talent, Caravan never broke into mainstream consciousness the way their progressive rock peers did. But those who did discover them found a band that balanced technical brilliance with pure, joyful songwriting. Number 11. Camel. Ask any prog rock fan about the greats, and you'll hear the same names: Pink Floyd, Genesis, King Crimson. But there's one name that should always be in that conversation: Camel. Camel never had a hit. They never had a radio anthem or a massive commercial breakthrough. But what they did have was some of the most gorgeous music of the entire progressive rock era. Led by guitarist Andy Latimer, Camel specialized in sweeping cinematic compositions that felt like soundtracks to imaginary films. Their 1974 album Mirage was a masterpiece, full of intricate yet effortlessly flowing melodies. Lady Fantasy was a soaring emotional journey, while Nimrodel, The Procession, The White Rider, transformed The Lord of the Rings into a progressive rock epic. But their crowning achievement, The Snow Goose, 1975. A fully instrumental concept album based on Paul Gallico's novel, The Snow Goose, was pure musical storytelling. Delicate, evocative, and completely mesmerizing, without a single lyric. It conveyed more than most bands could in an entire discography. So why weren't they bigger? Camel existed in a strange place. Not theatrical enough to match Genesis, not flashy enough to match Yes, not dark enough to match King Crimson. They were subtle, understated, and in an era when prog rock was all about excess. That meant they were often overlooked. But for those who did discover Camel, the reward was immense. Their music wasn't just technically impressive, it was deeply moving. And even now, decades later, it remains some of the most breathtakingly beautiful rock music ever recorded. Number 12. Can. Formed in the late 60s, Can was a band that refused to follow any rules. Their music was built on hypnotic rhythms, unpredictable structures, and a sense of controlled chaos. Tago Mago, 1971, was filled with tracks that felt more like living organisms than songs. Hallelujah was an 18-minute groove that locked you into a trance. Mushrooms sounded like a transmission from another planet. They weren't writing songs in the traditional sense. They were creating soundscapes. Albums like Ege Bamyasa, 1972, and Future Days, 1973, pushed their sound even further, blending jazz, funk, and avant-garde minimalism. David Bowie, Talking Heads, and just about every post-punk and electronic artist of the 80s and beyond took notes from Can. But back in the 70s, they were outsiders. Their music wasn't built for radio. It certainly wasn't designed for mainstream success. Instead, Can existed on the fringes, making some of the most influential music of the decade, while remaining largely unknown to the masses. And if Can was the sound of an alien groove machine, the next band took the same German experimentation and refined it into something that would reshape the future of music itself. Number 13. Neu! Emerging from the same German experimental scene that birthed Can, Neu was the brainchild of Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger, two former members of Kraftwerk. But where Kraftwerk was moving toward cold electronic precision, Neu took a different path, a relentless hypnotic rhythm known as the motoric beat. It was simple, it was mechanical, it was unstoppable. Their self-titled debut, Neu, 1972, was unlike anything else at the time. While most rock bands focused on big choruses and solos, Neu stripped everything down to its essence. Hallo Gallo, their defining track, was nearly 10 minutes of pure propulsion, driven by Dinger's metronomic drumming and Rother's shimmering atmospheric guitar. It didn't just move, it traveled. And that sound, it became everything. You hear it in Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, in Joy Division's icy minimalism, in the churning guitars of Sonic Youth, and the forward momentum of Stereolab. Even modern indie and electronic music owes a debt to Neu's hypnotic, pulsing energy. But at the time, nobody knew what to make of them. They were too rock for the experimental crowd, too experimental for the rock crowd. Their albums sold poorly. By 1975's Neu 75, tensions between Rother and Dinger were boiling. The duo disbanded soon after, leaving behind a legacy that would only grow with time. Their music was the future. It just took the world a while to catch up. Number 14. Amon Düül II. There are bands that experiment, and then there are bands that exist in a state of permanent experimentation. That was Amon Düül II. Their albums weren't collections of songs so much as sprawling, hallucinatory journeys into the unknown. Take Yeti, 1970, their defining masterpiece. It's chaotic, hypnotic, and utterly unpredictable. One moment you're lost in a trance of swirling guitars and ethereal chants. The next you're hit with a barrage of frenzied, distorted riffs that feel like a sonic earthquake. Their sound was part psychedelic rock, part progressive rock, part avant-garde madness. At times it felt like Pink Floyd's Uma Guma crossed with the raw, anarchic energy of punk. Except punk hadn't even been invented yet. Tracks like Archangel's Thunderbird felt like proto-metal, with jagged, aggressive guitar lines that hinted at future heavy psych. Meanwhile, extended pieces like Soap Shop Rock were pure mind-expanding improvisation, jamming that felt both tribal and futuristic at the same time. Amon Düül II's influence can't be overstated. They helped shape krautrock, a genre that would inspire everyone from David Bowie to Radiohead, to modern-day psych rock bands like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. When it comes to bands that created something completely original, our next group fused dark theatrics, jazz, and prog into a sound that was as unsettling as it was brilliant. Number 15. The Left Banke.
Just walk away, Renee. You won't see me follow.
Rock and classical music have always had a complicated relationship. Some bands leaned into symphonies, the moody blues. Some went full prog. But the Left Banke, they did something entirely different. They fused the two into something called Baroque pop, a genre that barely had time to exist before the 70s swept it away. In 1966, the Left Banke released Walk Away, Renee, a song so achingly beautiful it sounded like it had been plucked from a dream. Strings swelled, harpsichords danced, and lead singer Steve Martin's voice dripped with melancholy. It was a hit, but it was also unlike anything else on the charts. Their follow-up, Pretty Ballerina, was just as delicate, just as heartbreaking. The band had found a sound so rich, so ornate, it felt timeless. But behind the scenes, a disaster. Creative tensions, bad management, and ego clashes tore them apart before they could even finish their second album. By 1968, they were already splintering. The music industry moved on. The band's core lineup dissolved. And just like that, one of the most unique sounds of the decade disappeared. But the Left Banke left a mark. Decades later, artists like Elliott Smith and Bell and Sebastian would revive their rich orchestral sound. And while Baroque pop never became a dominant genre, the Left Banke proved it could be influential. If you've made it this far, here's a challenge for you. Pick one of these bands, find an album, put it on. Let yourself get lost in it, because once you dive into the world of these criminally underrated legends, you'll never look at classic rock the same way again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another mind-blowing music discovery. Got a favorite underrated band? Drop it in the comments. We're always hunting for the next hidden gem.